So cheating in an election is not just like cheating at something else, like a sport. It's not just unsporting. It's like a profound assault on democracy. But here's the thing, and the thing that we're seeing. The president's supporters do not care. They don't care. And the reason I think they don't care is because in their eyes, the president is cheating in furtherance of the will of the American people. That the ends justify the means. And by the American people, as they keep saying over and over and over again in the hearings, what they mean is their base.
This is about one basic fact. The Democrats have never accepted the will of the American people. 3 weeks ago, Nancy Pelosi called the President of the United States an imposter, and the attacks on the president started before the election.
House Republicans throughout the hearings and the markup, they kept talking about the will of the American people. It's worth remembering always that more people voted against Donald Trump than voted for him, right? 3 million more people. Now, it's true the Electoral College is the system we have, and that's why he's the president, but that's a very different thing than the will of the American people. And then there's also the fact that there was another election in 2018, and we know that the Republicans are in the minority, sitting on that dais in the minority, because nearly 10 million more Americans voted for the other party in 2018. So when they talk about the will of the American people, they are talking about a minority of those people. They just are. That's their base. But those are the people they view as real Americans. Those are the people that are worthy of representation. They are the rightful owners of this country's destiny. And we saw that on full display in the past couple of days. You know, Republicans, they've been making all these silly signs they've been putting up at the hearing, which maybe you've seen and maybe you haven't. But they put up one sign behind the markup during the impeachment article showing 7 members of the House Democratic leadership and the states they're from: California, New York, Massachusetts. And there were some tweets about like, oh, look at these out-of-touch coastal elite liberals, right? How dare they tell us what to do with our country? Those 3 states represent 1/5 of the entire population of the country, right? But honestly, it can feel like when you're watching these hearings and when you're watching politics that House Republicans particularly really don't view that part of the country that does not support them as legitimate. That they are not worthy of representation or political power or being able to like call the shots. Because those are not the right people. They're not the rightful heirs to the American project. And so, like Donald Trump, they are all in on this cheating as a political project for the party. And it goes beyond this impeachment. You have gerrymandering in states like Wisconsin, North Carolina, as soon as they get controlled by Republicans, and voter suppression. These things have become just endemic in states that Republicans control because they want to control who their voting constituency is. They want the right people voting. In Georgia, Brian Kemp is the governor, and he won by 50,000 votes over Stacey Abrams. Today, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution did this incredibly thorough statistical analysis to look at Kemp's own efforts to close down voting locations, precincts, and they found that those attempts took away probably between 54 to 85,000 votes. And the people disproportionately affected were African American. When Matt Bevin lost, the Republican incumbent in Kentucky, when he lost in Kentucky, he gave an interview and he blamed his loss on Democrats, quote, I'm quoting him here, harvesting votes in cities. As if the cities are not part of Kentucky. That's Kentucky. Louisville's part of Kentucky. And not just harvesting votes. Harvesting votes is getting votes from the human beings who cast them. There's a person on the other side of that vote. But when you say harvesting votes in cities, you're giving away how you think about those people. And so if you view it that way, then you could come to see cheating as righteous. Because the cheating is in furtherance of making sure that the right set of Americans keep their hold on power. And that is when you become a party of cheaters. And that's what hangs in the balance with this vote on impeachment, I think.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.